The day Josephine Abbott stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, in the blazing summer of 1878, the town looked back at her with the hollow eyes of a place that had forgotten what hope felt like. She stood on the unpaved main street with a leather satchel in one hand and a trunk being unloaded behind her, the hem of her blue traveling dress already collecting a fine red dust that seemed to rise from the earth like a living thing. The sun was merciless. The wind offered nothing in the way of comfort. There were perhaps 24 buildings lining the street, a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon that was already loud despite the early hour, a livery stable, and at the far end of the street, set slightly apart from everything else like an afterthought or a broken promise, a small whitewashed building with a bell tower that held no bell. That was her schoolhouse. Josephine had traveled 3 days by train from St. Louis, and another full day by stagecoach from Dodge City to reach Caldwell Creek, answering an advertisement placed by the town's fledgling school board in the Missouri Republican newspaper. The advertisement had been brief and optimistic in the way that frontier advertisements always were, promising a furnished schoolhouse, a modest salary paid monthly by the town council, and a community eager for education. What it had not mentioned was that the town had fallen into hard times after a cattle plague. The previous autumn had wiped out half the ranches within 20 miles, that 3 families had already packed up and left for Colorado, and that the children who remained were scattered so widely across the surrounding plains that gathering them in one place seemed about as likely as making it rain by asking politely. She had not known any of that when she accepted the position. She knew it now because the stagecoach driver, a leathery man named Felix who had the look of someone who had been rained on and dried out too many times, had told her everything on the last stretch of road, apparently feeling that she deserved fair warning. "Not trying to discourage you, miss," Felix had said, snapping the reins without looking at her. "Just saying, that schoolhouse has been sitting empty for the better part of a year. Town voted to advertise for a teacher back in the spring, full of optimism after the winter broke. But whether the families will send their young ones in, well, that's another matter entirely." Josephine had thanked him for his honesty and said nothing more. She was not the sort of woman who fell apart at complication. She had grown up the eldest of 5 children in a household where her schoolmaster father had made clear that education was the most reliable bridge between where a person was and where they wanted to be. When her father died of fever when she was 19, she had taken his teaching certificate examination herself, passed it at 20, and spent the next 4 years teaching in a St. Louis schoolroom. She was 24 now. With steady brown eyes and dark hair she kept pinned firmly at the back of her head, and she had decided somewhere between Dodge City and Caldwell Creek that this town needed her more than any comfortable St. Louis classroom did. Still, standing on that street with the sun hammering down and not a single child in sight, she felt the first cold touch of doubt. The woman who met her was Mrs. Edna Pruitt, the wife of the town's mayor and the self-appointed chairwoman of the school board, which appeared to consist of herself and 2 men who she later learned rarely attended meetings. Edna was a stout woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of practical energy that had built the frontier. She shook Josephine's hand with both of hers and looked her over frankly. "You're younger than I expected," Edna said, "but you have a solid look about you. Come on, I'll show you the schoolhouse and the room we've arranged for you to board in. You'll stay with the Harmon family. They have a spare room and they're good people." The schoolhouse was smaller than the one she had taught in back in Missouri, but it was clean, and someone had recently scrubbed the floors and restocked the wood supply beside the small iron stove. There were 12 desks arranged in 2 rows. Someone had built them by hand, and while they were not elegant, they were sturdy. There was a chalkboard spanning most of one wall, and a shelf that held a collection of books that appeared to have been donated in various states of disrepair. "How many students should I expect on the first day?" Josephine asked, running a finger along the edge of one of the desks. Edna was quiet for a moment, which was more honest than any answer she could have given. "The Harmon family has 2 children, a boy of 9 and a girl of 7, she said carefully. "The Whitfields on the Eastern Road have a boy of 12. Beyond that, I am not entirely certain who will come. The ranches are spread out, and after the losses last year, families are not inclined to spend time on anything that doesn't put food on the table." Josephine nodded slowly. "And the date the school is meant to open?" "Monday next," Edna said. "That gives you a week to settle in." That first week in Caldwell Creek was the loneliest of Josephine's life, though she refused to grant it that title out loud. She spent her mornings preparing the schoolroom, arranging the books by subject, writing sample lessons on the chalkboard, and repairing a window latch that had come loose on one side. She spent her afternoons walking the town, learning where things were and introducing herself to whoever she encountered. The people of Caldwell Creek were not unfriendly exactly, but they had the wariness of people who had been disappointed enough times to keep new arrivals at arm's length until they proved they intended to stay. She met the general store owner, a man named Abe Shelby, who gave her a peppermint stick and told her she was brave. She met the town's doctor, a quiet young man named Dr. Callum Hare, who had arrived from Pennsylvania the previous year, and who seemed deeply relieved to encounter another person from the East. She met 3 other women at the Sunday church service who looked at her with a mixture of admiration and pity that she found equally difficult to accept gracefully. What she did not meet in that entire first week was a man named Lionel Archer. She heard his name, though, several times. The first time was at the general store, when Abe Shelby mentioned that Lionel Archer's ranch was the largest remaining operation in the region after the plague, that he had somehow managed to hold on to most of his herd because of a combination of luck and the sheer exhausting vigilance with which he had worked through the winter. The second time was at the church, when one of the women mentioned that Lionel Archer had a boy, 8 years old, who was sharp as a tack and had never had a day of proper schooling. The third time was from Edna Pruitt herself, who said it quite casually over tea that if Josephine could get Lionel Archer on her side, the other ranchers would follow, because in Caldwell Creek, when Lionel Archer said a thing was worth doing, people generally believed him. "Why is that?" Josephine had asked. Edna had considered her teacup. "He saved this town last winter," she said simply. When the plague hit, and the ranchers were talking about folding everything up and moving on, Lionel was the one who said they were staying. He organized the effort to contain the sick cattle. He donated beef for the families who had nothing left, and when the Dawson family lost everything, he gave them enough lumber to rebuild their barn. People here owe him something that goes beyond money. They owe him the belief that staying was worth it. Josephine turned this information over in her mind as she walked back to the Harmon house that evening. The sky over the plains was the color of hammered copper, and a warm wind moved through the tall grass along the road in long, rolling waves. She had not come to Caldwell Creek to win anyone's approval. She had come to teach. But she was practical enough to understand that teaching required students, and students required parents who believed in the endeavor. And apparently in this particular corner of Kansas, belief flowed from one particular cowboy. Monday arrived with the indifference that early August mornings in Kansas had toward human anticipation. The sky was pale blue and already hot by 7 in the morning. Josephine had been awake since 5. She had dressed carefully, choosing her gray teaching dress because it was professional without being severe, and she had arranged the desks one final time, even though they had been perfectly arranged since Thursday. She had written a welcome message on the chalkboard in her clearest hand. She had placed a small jar of wildflowers she had gathered herself on the corner of her desk. At 8 o'clock, which was the appointed time, she stood at the doorway of the schoolhouse and looked down the main street of Caldwell Creek. It was empty. At 8:15, the Harmon children appeared, brought by their mother, who seemed apologetic about the fact that they were the only ones. Thomas Harmon was 9, sturdy and brown-haired, with the kind of serious expression that children develop when they have grown up with adults who work hard. His sister Clara was 7 and small and had enormous gray eyes that moved around the schoolroom with frank curiosity. Their mother left quickly, with the efficiency of a woman who had other work to do. At 8:30, the Whitfield boy arrived alone on a gray horse he tied to the post outside. His name was Samuel. He was 12 and tall for his age, and he had the dignified reserve of a child who had spent most of his life working alongside adults. He said good morning to Josephine with precise politeness and chose a desk near the back. At 9 o'clock, no one else had come. Josephine looked at her three students who were watching her with a patient expectancy that was more faith than she felt she deserved in that moment, and she made a decision. She smiled at them with all the warmth and conviction she possessed, walked to the chalkboard, and began to teach. She had always believed that the quality of a lesson had nothing to do with the size of the audience receiving it. She taught Thomas and Clara and Samuel as if the room were full, because they deserved it. She read them a passage from one of the donated books, a story about exploration, and she turned it into a geography lesson about the rivers and territories of the American West. She gave Samuel a mathematics problem that challenged him, and gave the younger two a writing exercise that delighted Clara and made Thomas concentrate so hard his tongue appeared between his lips. By noon, when she called a break and they ate their lunches outside in the shade of the building, she felt the familiar deep satisfaction of having taught something well, even though she could not entirely silence the question of how she was going to fill 12 desks. That afternoon, while the children worked on an exercise she had set for them, she made a decision. She was going to find Lionel Archer. She had not been introduced to him. She did not know exactly where his ranch was. But she had a general direction from Edna's description, and she had a free hour after school let out at 3, and she had the stubborn kind of determination that had carried her across 3 states with a trunk and a satchel, and not a single assurance of success. She asked Abe Shelby at the general store for directions to the Archer Ranch, and he gave them to her with the mild surprise of a man watching someone do something sensible that he hadn't thought of himself. It was 4 miles east on the main road, and then south on a track marked by a gate made of 2 tall cedar posts. She thanked him and set out on foot, because she did not own a horse, though she was beginning to understand that in Caldwell Creek a horse was less a luxury than a necessity. The walk took her the better part of an hour, and the heat was considerable, but the plains in the late afternoon had a beauty that she was only beginning to learn to read. The grass ran gold and green in every direction, and the sky was enormous in a way that Missouri skies never quite managed, as if out here the sky took up more than its fair share of the world. Red-tailed hawks circled above the road. Once, in the distance, she saw a small herd of pronghorn antelope moving in a tight group through the grass. She found the cedar post gate exactly where Abe had described it and turned south. The track led her past a water tank and a corral that held a dozen horses, past a long, low bunkhouse where she could hear men's voices, and up to a main ranch house that was larger than most of the buildings in town, made of good timber with a covered porch along the front and flower boxes under the windows that surprised her, because they were planted with marigolds, and she had not expected marigolds on a cattle ranch. She was about 20 feet from the porch steps when a voice came from around the side of the house. "If you're looking for work, you'll want to go around to the bunkhouse." She turned. Leaning against the corner of the house with a bridle in his hands that he appeared to have been mending, was a man in his early 30s, tall and lean in the way that men who spend most of their lives in physical labor become, with dark hair that curled slightly at his temples where the sweat had dampened it, and a face that was weathered from the sun, but still held a quality she could only describe as attentive, as if he was the kind of person who listened carefully to the world. He wore a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, working trousers, and boots that had seen serious use. He was watching her with the kind of direct, unguarded curiosity that she found more comfortable than pretense. "I'm not looking for work," she said. "I'm looking for Lionel Archer." Something shifted in his expression. He stood up a little straighter. "You found him." "I'm Josephine Abbott," she said. "I'm the new school teacher." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite classify, not unfriendly but careful. "I heard you'd arrived," he said. "You're the one who came from St. Louis." "I am." She walked toward him and held out her hand, which he shook after a brief pause, as if the formality of it had caught him slightly off guard. His hand was rough and warm. "I came to speak with you about your son." Now his expression changed more clearly, tightening slightly around the eyes. "My boy is 8 years old and he helps me run this ranch," he said. "I'm not sending him 4 miles on horseback every day." "I understand that concern entirely," Josephine said evenly, because she had prepared for resistance of exactly this kind. "Which is why I wanted to speak with you directly rather than wait for you to come to me. The school is open. There are 3 children attending. 3 is not a school, Mr. Archer. It is a reading circle. I need more students, and I am told that when you say a thing is worth doing, people in this town believe you." He studied her with an expression that was now something between surprised and amused. "Who told you that?" "Several people." He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He set the bridle down on the porch rail and said, "Come around back. I want to show you something." She followed him around the side of the ranch house to the backyard, where a vegetable garden ran along the fence line and a large oak tree provided deep shade over a section of packed earth. Sitting in that shade, with a stick in his hand and apparently drawing something in the dirt, was a boy. He looked up when he heard their footsteps, and Josephine saw immediately what Edna Pruitt had meant by sharp as a tack. He had his father's dark hair and his own pair of bright, observant eyes that seemed to be taking in everything at once. "Eli," Lionel said, "this is Miss Abbott. She's the new school teacher." The boy stood up immediately with the manners of someone who had been taught to show respect. "Good afternoon, Miss Abbott." "Good afternoon, Eli." She looked at what he had drawn in the dirt. It appeared to be a detailed map of something, carefully rendered with the stick. "What is that?" "The south pasture," Eli said. "I'm drawing where the water runs when it rains heavy, because Father says we need to think about where we put the new fence line." Josephine looked at Lionel, who was watching her with an expression she recognized now as a kind of challenge, as if he was waiting to see how she responded to evidence of his son's intelligence. "That is very good thinking," she said to Eli. "Do you know how to translate what you have drawn into a proper scale map, with measurements and notation?" Eli blinked. "No, ma'am." "That is something I could teach you," she said, "along with the mathematics that would let you calculate water flow and fence requirements to within a very precise degree." She looked at Lionel then. "Those are not small skills on a cattle ranch, Mr. Archer." Lionel's jaw shifted slightly. He looked at his son, who was looking at Josephine with undisguised interest. "Can I go, Father?" Eli asked. Lionel looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked at Josephine with an expression that she would come to learn was his version of deciding. "The ride is 4 miles, he said. "There and back. That is a significant portion of a working day for a ranch hand of any age." "I agree," she said. "Which is why I would like to propose that you bring Eli and anyone else you might convince to send school in the mornings, and I will walk out to work with any children who live too far to come in easily, at least until we establish a proper rotation." He stared at her. "You'd walk 4 miles out and 4 miles back. If it means those children receive an education, yes." She said it simply because she meant it simply, without drama. There was a long silence in the warm afternoon air. A dove called somewhere in the oak tree. Eli was watching his father with the bright, barely contained hope of a child who wanted very much to go to school and was wise enough not to say so again. "Let me think on it," Lionel said finally. "Of course," Josephine said. "Good evening, Mr. Archer." "Good evening, Eli." She walked back to town in the cooling afternoon, and she did not let herself wonder what Lionel Archer would decide until she was safely back in her room at the Harmon house, where she allowed herself precisely 10 minutes of worried contemplation before she opened her lesson book and began planning the next day. She did not have to wait long to find out what he had decided. The following morning, Josephine arrived at the schoolhouse at 7:30 to air the room and write the day's lessons on the board. At 7:45, she heard horses outside. She went to the door. Lionel Archer was in the street on a bay horse, and behind him on a smaller gray horse was Eli, and behind Eli in a small wagon driven by a woman Josephine did not recognize were 4 more children of varying ages. Josephine walked out to meet them, shading her eyes from the morning sun. "Good morning, Mr. Archer," she said. He touched the brim of his hat, which was a wide-brimmed felt hat the color of dust. "Good morning, Miss Abbott." He nodded toward the wagon. "Mrs. Cassidy lives 1/2 mile from me. 3 of those children are hers. The 4th is the O'Brien girl from the ranch north of ours. Her mother asked me to bring her." He paused. "I rode out this morning to speak with the Hanley family as well. They have 2 children, but they live 8 miles out and the father is not sure about the distance. I told him you'd said you were willing to come to them." She looked at him steadily. "I did say that. I told him you meant it." He held her gaze for a moment. "Do you?" "Every word." Something in his expression eased almost imperceptibly, like a knot loosening slightly. "Then I expect they'll send their children within the week." Bill Hanley doesn't say no to something that his wife has already said yes to. He looked at the children climbing down from the wagon and then back at her. "You have 7 students this morning, Miss Abbott." She felt something warm move through her chest, something that was partly relief and partly gratitude, and partly something else that she was not quite ready to name yet because she had known this man for less than 24 hours. "Thank you," she said. "Will you stay for a moment? I'd like to know the names of the children you've brought." He dismounted in the fluid way of a man who had spent most of his adult life getting on and off horses, and he introduced her to the Cassidy children. Nora, who was 10, James, who was 8, and little Pete, who was 6 and clung to his sister's hand with the gravity of a very small person taking a very large step. The O'Brien girl was named Bridget. She was 9, and she had a spray of freckles across her nose and a look of determined cheerfulness. Josephine greeted each of them by name and watched them file into the schoolhouse with a feeling of enormous, almost overwhelming purpose. She turned back to find Lionel still standing by his horse, watching the door through which the children had disappeared. "You have a good heart," she said before she decided to say it. He looked at her with something startled in his eyes, as if he hadn't expected to be seen so directly. "I have a son who deserves an education," he said. "Same as every other child in this county." "Yes," she said. "But you went out and said that to the other families before I asked you to. You didn't have to do that." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the schoolhouse. "My wife used to say this town needed a school more than it needed another saloon," he said, and his voice had changed quality, a slight flatness entering it that told her this was tender ground. "She passed 2 years ago. Fever. She was very—" He stopped, started again. "She believed in things like this." Josephine did not offer hollow comfort, which she had always found to be an insult to grief. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "I hope that whatever she believed this school could be, we might come close to it." He looked at her then, a direct and unguarded look that lasted just a moment too long before he put it away behind a nod. "I ought to get back," he said. He mounted his horse with easy grace. "I'll bring Eli at 8 o'clock each morning if the weather holds. If it doesn't, I'll send word." "Thank you, Mr. Archer." He rode away without looking back, and Josephine stood in the morning sun for a moment longer than was necessary, watching the road after he had gone. Then she shook herself firmly back into her professional responsibilities and went inside to teach. The next 2 weeks were among the most productive of Josephine's teaching life. As Lionel had predicted, the Hanley children appeared at the end of the first week, brought in by their mother in a wagon on Monday morning. Their names were Rose and Daniel, 11 and 9 respectively, and they were hungry for learning in a way that Josephine found deeply moving. By the end of the second week, she had 11 students in her schoolhouse, including the Whitfield boy Samuel, who had been there from the first day, and the 12 desks were nearly full. The 13th student was a problem that no one had anticipated. His name was Domingo Vega, and he was 10 years old, the son of a Mexican ranch hand named Rafael who worked on one of the smaller spreads north of town. Rafael had come to the schoolhouse himself on a Tuesday afternoon, holding his hat in both hands, to ask if his son might attend. His English was careful and deliberate, the English of a man who had learned it entirely by necessity and practice. "My son, he is smart," Rafael said. "My wife, she teach him to read some in Spanish, but he needs school, real school." Josephine did not hesitate for a single moment. "He is welcome to come tomorrow morning," she said. Rafael looked at her with an expression of such plain gratitude that it made her throat tight. "Some people, they say maybe a Mexican boy should not be in the school with the others," he said carefully. Josephine felt a clean, uncomplicated anger move through her, the kind that does not produce heat but instead produces clarity. "This school is for every child in this county," she said. "Domingo will be treated exactly as every other student. If anyone says otherwise to you or to him, you come and tell me directly." Rafael nodded slowly. "Yes, Miss Abbott. Thank you, Miss Abbott." Domingo appeared the next morning, a slight, serious-faced boy with large, dark eyes and the neatest shirt Josephine had ever seen on a 10-year-old, which told her how much his arrival at school meant to his family. She introduced him to the class with the same straightforward warmth she used for every new student, and she was pleased to see that none of the children reacted with anything other than ordinary curiosity. Children, she had long believed, learned their prejudices from adults. Left to themselves, they were far more sensible. She heard later from Edna Prout that there had been some murmuring in town among certain adults about the Mexican boy attending school alongside the others. Edna had dealt with it by saying, in her characteristically final way, that the schoolteacher was the authority within the schoolhouse, and that was the end of the matter. Josephine was grateful, and she made a point of telling Edna so. It was in this third week that Josephine began to see Lionel Archer regularly, not as a visitor or a benefactor, but as a daily presence, because he brought Eli to school himself each morning rather than sending him with anyone else. She had assumed after the first few days that he would assign the task to one of his ranch hands. He did not. Every morning at 8 o'clock, the bay horse appeared in the street, and Lionel Archer swung down from the saddle, walked Eli to the schoolhouse door, and exchanged a few minutes of conversation with Josephine before riding back to his work. Their conversations were not remarkable in their subjects. They talked about the weather, which in August in Kansas was a legitimate daily concern. They talked about the children, about which ones were struggling and which ones were excelling, because Lionel had the deep investment in children's learning that Josephine was coming to understand, was one of his defining characteristics. They talked sometimes about the town, about the tensions and hopes of a frontier community trying to hold itself together through economic difficulty. What made the conversations remarkable was their quality. Lionel Archer did not speak in the casual, indifferent way of a man making polite conversation. He engaged with whatever subject arose as if it mattered, because apparently to him it did. He listened when she spoke with a quality of attention that she found both unusual and deeply pleasant. He disagreed with her sometimes, and when he did he said so directly and with clear reasoning rather than being disagreeable about it. When she made a point he had not considered, she could see him actually considering it, which was rarer than she would have liked to admit. She began to find herself aware of his arrival before she saw him, a kind of tuning of attention that she recognized with mild alarm as the early signals of a feeling she had not come to Kansas to develop. She was not inexperienced in the matter of romantic feeling. She was 24 and had been the object of interest from several young men in St. Louis, and she had felt interest in return on a couple of occasions, though nothing that had been substantial enough to alter the course of her plans. What she was feeling about Lionel Archer was different in a way she could not precisely articulate, which she found significant, because she was generally quite good at articulation. She told herself firmly that she was in Caldwell Creek to build a school, not a romance, and that a 31-year-old widower with a ranch and a son who brought his child to school every morning was almost certainly not thinking about the schoolteacher in any way beyond professional appreciation. She told herself this with conviction for approximately 2.5 weeks before reality declined to cooperate. It was a Saturday in late August, and Josephine had taken the day to do a more thorough inventory of the schoolroom's books, because she had written to the St. Louis Public Library requesting donations, and she wanted to know exactly what she was working with before she received them. She was on her knees beside the shelf, going through a stack of readers, when she heard boots on the schoolhouse porch. She stood up to find Lionel in the doorway, holding his hat in one hand and what appeared to be a large jar of preserved peaches in the other. He looked at her kneeling on the floor with a stack of books and seemed briefly uncertain. "The door was open," he said. "Come in," she said, and brushed the dust from her dress with as much dignity as she could manage. "Is something wrong with Eli?" "No, Eli's fine." He held out the jar. "My housekeeper put up peaches this week. She puts up enough for an army and then looks at me reproachfully if I don't distribute them. I thought you might like some." She took the jar and looked at it and then looked at him, and something in her chest did a small, complicated thing. "That is very thoughtful," she said. "Please thank your housekeeper." "You could thank her yourself," he said. "We're having a supper tomorrow at the ranch, nothing formal. The Cassidys are coming and the O'Briens. You'd be welcome." He said it with a particular kind of careful casualness that she recognized as a man who was not entirely sure of his welcome himself. "Eli has been wanting to show you the horses." She looked at him steadily. "I would like that very much," she said. He nodded, and something in his expression settled, like a tension he had been holding had found somewhere to go. 4 o'clock, he said. "I'll send someone with a horse for you since you can't exactly walk 4 miles to a supper and back." "I appreciate that," she said. "Mr. Archer." "Lionel," he said, and then seemed to reconsider whether he had been too forward. "If you'd like." "Josephine," she said in return, and watched him process this with a seriousness that made her want to smile. He left, and she stood in the schoolhouse with the jar of preserved peaches, and the very clear understanding that she was not going to be able to maintain a professional distance from Lionel Archer for much longer, and that this was not entirely unwelcome information. The Sunday supper at the Archer Ranch was the first purely social occasion Josephine had attended since arriving in Caldwell Creek, and it was warm and loud in the way of gatherings where people know each other well and are genuinely glad to be together. Mrs. Cassidy was a red-haired woman of infectious energy who talked about her children with the frank pride of someone who found them remarkable, which Josephine was happy to confirm was warranted. The O'Brien family, Patrick and his wife Maura, were quieter but equally kind. There were 7 children of various ages running through the yard in the long summer evening, and the sound of their voices filled the space between the buildings in a way that made Josephine realize how much she had been missing ordinary joyful noise. Lionel's housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Flores, a sturdy widow of perhaps 60 who had worked at the ranch for 5 years, and who looked Josephine over with an assessing thoroughness that reminded Josephine of her own grandmother, and that she suspected was meant to. Mrs. Flores fed them all lavishly: beef roasted with dried chilies and herbs, cornbread, the preserved peaches that appeared alongside everything else like a statement of domestic abundance. Eli had shown Josephine the horses with the serious pride of a child, showing someone something they love. He had a particular bond with a small brown mare named Clover, and he told Josephine in careful detail about each horse's personality and history, which told her a great deal about the kind of boy he was, and the kind of man his father was raising him to be. She and Lionel had found themselves side by side on the porch steps as the evening cooled, the children's voices coming from somewhere in the direction of the corral, the adults inside finishing the last of the coffee. The sky had gone violet and then deep blue, and the stars were beginning to appear in numbers that never failed to astonish her, out here where there was no city light to dim them. "He's doing well in school," she said. "Eli, he's genuinely ahead of most children his age in mathematics, and he has a remarkable visual memory." "He gets the visual memory from his mother," Lionel said. "She could look at a piece of needlework once and reproduce it perfectly." His voice had that particular quality again when he mentioned his wife, a careful distance that honored grief while not being consumed by it. "What was her name?" Josephine asked. "Margaret," he said. "Maggie." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you. She would have said exactly the same things you said to me when you came to the ranch that first time, about what it means to give these children an education." Josephine looked at the stars and felt the weight of what he was trusting her with. "That is a very fine thing to say." "I mean it plainly," he said. "It's not sentiment. It's just a thing I noticed." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking at the yard, his elbows resting on his knees, and his profile against the early stars was the profile of a man who had taken on considerable burdens and carried them without expecting applause. She thought about what Edna had told her, about how he had held this town together through a bad winter, and about the flower boxes with the marigolds, which she had decided were planted for Margaret and tended by him in her absence. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. He looked at her. "Yes." "The flower boxes with the marigolds, did she plant those?" A slow, genuine smile moved across his face, the first full smile she had seen from him, and it changed his face in a way that she filed away in her memory with a care that she recognized as a sign of something. "She planted the first ones," he said. "She loved marigolds, said they kept the pests away from the vegetables and they smelled like summer." He paused. "I replant them every spring." "Because you love her," Josephine said, and there was no question in it. "Because I love her," he agreed. "And because Eli should know that the things she cared about are still worth caring about." He was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't seem like enough, but it's what I have." She sat with that for a moment. "I think it is more than enough," she said. The evening ended, and one of the ranch hands rode her back to town on a spare horse, and Josephine sat in her room at the Harmon house afterward and looked at the candle flame until it burned low, and acknowledged to herself with perfect clarity that she was falling in love with Lionel Archer, and that there was very little she intended to do to stop it. What she did instead of stopping it was continue to teach, because the school was what she had come to Caldwell Creek for, and the school was where she had the most power to do something good. She threw herself into the work with the full force of her capabilities, and the children responded as children will when they feel that the person teaching them genuinely believes they are worth the effort. Eli Archer was one of her most satisfying students, not because he was the brightest, though he was bright, but because he had the kind of curiosity that teaching is designed to feed. He asked questions that sent her to her books and sometimes, honestly, sent her to write letters to academic contacts in St. Louis to get proper answers. He drew maps of the ranch with increasing precision as she taught him scale and measurement. He became interested in the history of the plains through which his family had traveled to come west, and he asked her one afternoon whether the Comanche people who had lived on this land before the settlers had their own way of reading the landscape. And she spent an entire afternoon lesson on that question, because it was exactly the kind of thing that a good education should include. It was also through the school that Josephine began to understand the fuller dimensions of the town's struggle. She could see it in the children, in the way some of them came in with the hollow look that meant they had not had quite enough to eat, in the winter coats that were already too small as September approached, in the pride and precaution with which some of them treated their books because there were no extras at home. She began, quietly, to do what she could. She kept a tin of crackers and dried fruit in her desk drawer, and offered it at midday as a general snack without calling attention to it. She wrote additional letters to Missouri, to her former colleagues and to the churches she knew, requesting donated supplies. Lionel noticed. Of course he noticed. He had the attentiveness of a man who watched the world closely, and Josephine was in his world every morning when he brought his son to school. "The Vega boy," he said to her one September morning, after the children had gone inside and they were standing in the autumn light that had begun to carry a crisp edge. His father had a bad September. "The ranch he works for cut his hours." "I know," Josephine said. "Domingo's shoes are wearing through." Lionel was quiet for a moment. "I have some leather in the shop," he said. "I can make a pair of shoes." She looked at him. "Can you?" "My father was a cobbler," he said with a slight lift at the corner of his mouth, "before he came west." "Then yes," she said, "please." A week later, Domingo Vega came to school in new shoes. He sat in his desk with the careful dignity of a 10-year-old who has received something meaningful and wants to honor it. And Josephine went home that evening and thought about Lionel Archer making shoes in his workshop by lamplight, and felt something so warm and specific in her chest that she had to sit very still with it for a while. In October, the weather turned serious in the way that Kansas autumn weather does, with none of the gentle gradations of the eastern states, and the distances between the outlying ranches and the school became genuinely difficult. Lionel arrived one morning and said without preamble that he had spoken to Patrick O'Brien and Tom Cassidy, and that between the three ranches they were going to work out a rotation to bring the more distant children in on weekdays, so that no child missed more than one day in 10 due to weather. "You organized this yourself," Josephine said. "The children needed it organizing," he said, as if this were a complete and sufficient explanation, which she supposed it was. "Lionel," she said, and she said his name with the particular weight that it now carried when she said it, the weight of 4 months of morning conversations and a Sunday supper and preserved peaches and new shoes made by lamplight. "This school would not exist in the way it does without what you have done. I need you to know that I am aware of that." He held her gaze for a moment, and in his eyes was something that she had been watching develop over weeks, a kind of careful, deliberate warmth, the warmth of a man who felt something and was choosing very intentionally how and whether to express it. "Josephine," he said, and her name in his voice had its own weight, the weight of morning light and someone learning how to be careful with something they did not want to damage. "Can I call on you this Sunday?" Her heart did something straightforward and undeniable. "Yes," she said, "you can." He came on Sunday with a small bunch of dried wildflowers, because there were no fresh ones in October on the Kansas plains, and this practical romanticism struck her as so entirely characteristic of him that she put the flowers in a glass of water and looked at them on the windowsill for the rest of the afternoon as they talked over tea in the Harmon family's front parlor, which Mrs. Harmon vacated with a tactful cheerfulness that made Josephine appreciate her enormously. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about everything and nothing, about his childhood in Indiana and her childhood in Missouri, about his decision to come west at 23 with Margaret, newly married, and the first 2 years of breaking land that had been harder than anything he could have prepared for. He talked about Margaret with the openness of a man who had done his grieving honestly and had arrived, 2 years on, at a place where love and loss could coexist without destroying him. He talked about Eli, about the weight of raising a son alone, and the particular ache of seeing Eli look for his mother in crowds sometimes, still, 2 years later. She told him about her father, about learning to teach from watching him, and then sitting his examination, and feeling that she was carrying something of him forward. She told him about the strange freedom of having come so far from everything she knew and finding that she was, if not at home in Caldwell Creek yet, at least aimed in the right direction. "Are you happy here?" he asked, not with hope in the question but with genuine inquiry, the kind that could handle an honest answer. She thought about it carefully. "I am becoming happy here," she said, "which is different from being unhappy and also different from the easy happiness of familiar things. It is the harder kind that means something more." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that careful, unhurried attention. "That is a very precise way to describe something," he said. "I am a schoolteacher," she said. "Precision is something I try to practice." "You succeed at it," he said, and there was something in his voice that made the word practice carry more than its literal meaning, as if he was saying that the precision with which she had described her happiness applied also to the precision with which she had seen him, on that first visit to the ranch and on every morning since. He left at dusk with his hat in his hand, standing on the Harmon front porch in the last of the October light, and the way he looked at her before he put the hat on and stepped down from the porch was very clear in its meaning. She watched him ride away, and then stood on the porch for a moment in the cold air, looking at the wide, flat sky where a three-quarter moon was rising, and she felt something settle inside her like a weight finding its proper place. November brought cold, real cold, the plains winter beginning to assert itself with a clarity that was not cruel but was entirely honest. The school attendance held steady because of the arrangement Lionel had organized, and inside the schoolhouse with the iron stove going, the room had a warm, close quality that Josephine loved, the quality of a space where good things were happening inside while the cold and the wide world waited outside. Lionel continued to call on Sundays, and their Sunday afternoons became the week's fixed point around which everything else organized itself in Josephine's private experience of time. They fell into patterns, a natural and easy back and forth of conversation and sometimes companionable silence, of small exchanges about the world they shared and larger ones about the world inside themselves. She discovered that he had a dry and quiet sense of humor that appeared when he was comfortable, and that he had strong opinions about cattle and about landscape and about the proper construction of a fence, and that when he held an opinion, he held it with reasoning attached and could be moved by better reasoning, which was not a common quality in men or anyone else. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday in late November, standing on the Harmon porch in a way that by then had become their ritual goodbye, except that on this Sunday, he paused with his hat in his hand and said, "Josephine," and when she looked at him, he kissed her with a care and a directness that were perfectly matched to everything she knew of him, so that it felt not like a surprise but like a fulfillment of something already understood. She put her hand against his jaw, where the cold air had brought some color to his face, and kissed him back with her whole self, because she was not the kind of person who did things partially. When they stepped apart, he looked at her with something in his eyes that was joy made cautious by its own importance, the expression of a man who has been given something he values too much to take for granted. "I should have done that 3 weeks ago," he said. "Probably 4," she said, and the laugh that came out of him was real and warm, and she filed it in the same careful place she kept his full smile. December arrived with its first real snowfall, and the schoolhouse was transformed into what Josephine could only describe as the most beautiful classroom she had ever occupied, with the snow outside the windows and the stove burning steadily inside, and the children's breath making small clouds when they came in from outside, and the particular quality of winter light that fell through the windows in the morning hours and turned everything it touched into something close to sacred. She planned a small Christmas performance for the children, not an ambitious production, but a program of readings and songs that they practiced in the afternoons during the final week of term. Each child recited something they had selected themselves. Eli chose a passage about the geography of the Great Plains that he had memorized from one of the donated books, and he delivered it with such quiet precision that Josephine had to look down at her book for a moment to collect herself. Domingo Vega recited a poem he had written himself in English about the plains in winter, and it was so genuinely beautiful that, when he finished, the silence before the applause had a quality of held breath that was the best response a piece of writing can receive. The performance was held on the last Friday afternoon before the Christmas holiday, and the parents came, crowding into the small schoolroom in their winter coats, sitting on the edges of the desks and standing along the walls, and Josephine stood at the front of the room and looked at all of them and felt the specific, strong pleasure of having built something where there had been nothing. Lionel sat in the back of the room with his arms folded and watched his son recite about the Great Plains with an expression on his face that Josephine caught only because she was looking for it. The expression of a man watching the future of someone he loves unfold with more richness than he had dared to hope for. He met her eyes across the room afterward, and what passed between them was real and large and required no words. The Christmas holiday ran 2 weeks, and during those 2 weeks Josephine spent Christmas Day itself at the Archer Ranch, which Eli had been the one to suggest, with the artless confidence of a child who understood that the two most important adults in his life liked each other, and assumed the natural next step was to spend holidays together. Mrs. Flores had decorated the ranch house with pine boughs and red ribbons, and there was a small spruce tree in the corner of the front room, hung with strings of dried berries and paper ornaments that Eli had made at school. They ate an enormous Christmas dinner, and then sat by the fire in the long winter afternoon, and Eli showed Josephine his collection of arrowheads, found on the ranch over several years, each one labeled in his neat handwriting with where and when he had found it. She sat on the floor with him and looked at each one, and she was aware of Lionel watching them from the chair beside the fire with a warmth in his face that he had stopped trying to conceal, and she thought that this was happiness, the completed kind, the kind she had described to him in October as harder and more meaningful. January brought a blizzard that shut the school for a full week, and Josephine spent those days at the Harmon house, watching the snow pile against the windows and writing curriculum plans with the intensity of someone channeling their energy into productive use to avoid the particular frustration of being snowbound. On the third day, she heard a knock at the door and opened it to find a snow-covered Lionel Archer on the porch with a covered pot in his hands. She stared at him. "You rode 4 miles in a blizzard. The snow stopped for 2 hours this morning," he said, with the perfectly reasonable air of a man who had calculated the weather window precisely. Mrs. Flores made chili. She let him in and took the pot and looked at him as he pulled the snow from his hat and coat, and she said, "Lionel Archer, you are the most practical romantic I have ever encountered in my life." He looked at her. "Is that a compliment?" "It is the highest compliment I know how to give," she said. He stayed for the afternoon, and they talked and played cards with the Harmon children, who were also snowbound and delighted by the company. And when the weather darkened toward evening and he prepared to leave, she walked him to the door and he held her face in his cold hands and kissed her with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. February arrived, and the school resumed, and the routine that had become the architecture of Josephine's life in Caldwell Creek settled back into place. 12 students, morning lessons and afternoon lessons. Lionel at the door each morning with Eli and his unfailing, steady, particular attention. In February, on a Tuesday that had no particular distinction from any other Tuesday until it did, Lionel appeared at the schoolhouse door at the end of the school day, after the children had gone home. He was not there as a parent collecting a child, because Eli had ridden home with the Cassidy children. He was there simply as himself, in his good coat and his cleaned boots and with his hat in his hands. Josephine looked at him from the doorway. "I have something I want to say to you," he said, "and I'd rather say it here than on a porch or through a parlor visit, because this school is where I first understood who you were and what you were doing, and it seems right." She stepped back to let him in. He came into the schoolroom that smelled of chalk and wood smoke, and the particular slightly papery smell of children's learning, and he stood in the center of it and looked at her with an expression that had nothing held back in it for the first time since she had known him. "I love you," he said. "I have been working up to saying that plainly for some weeks now, and the working up has been its own experience, but I am tired of the approach and I want to arrive. I love you, Josephine. You came to this town with a satchel and a conviction, and you walked 4 miles across the plains to argue with me about my son's education, and you make shoes happen for children who need them without making anyone feel they are receiving charity, and you have given Eli something I could not give him, which is the knowledge that learning is an act of joy." He paused. And beyond all of that, you are the person I most want to be in the world with, and I would very much like to ask you to marry me if you are willing to hear that question." Josephine stood very still for a moment. The afternoon light came through the schoolhouse windows in the particular way of winter light, and the room was warm from the stove that had been burning all day, and she looked at Lionel Archer in the middle of the classroom he had helped fill, and she thought that there was no place in the world she would rather have received this question. "Yes," she said. "I am willing to hear it, and I am willing to answer it, and the answer is yes." He crossed the distance between them in 3 steps and took her hands in his, and she looked up at him with the feeling of someone arriving at a place that was exactly right, and he kissed her in the middle of the schoolroom with the afternoon sun coming through the windows. They were married in March, in the church on the main street of Caldwell Creek, on a Saturday morning when the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the greening of the plains and the return of birds to the tree lines along the creek. The ceremony was attended by what appeared to be the entire population of Caldwell Creek plus the outlying ranches, because a wedding in a small town on the frontier is both a celebration and an affirmation, a declaration that the community intends to keep existing and to keep building. Edna Prout sat in the front pew with the satisfied expression of a woman who had set something in motion and was pleased with where it had gone. Mrs. Flores had made 3 separate cakes, which she presented at the reception afterward at the Archer Ranch, with the decisive pride of someone who considers baking a competitive endeavor. Eli stood beside his father during the ceremony with the careful gravity of an 8-year-old, who has been entrusted with the wedding ring, and who understands that this is the most important job he has ever had. When Josephine walked down the aisle on Dr. Callum Hare's arm, because he was the closest friend she had made in Caldwell Creek who was not the man she was marrying, she saw Lionel waiting for her at the front of the church with a look on his face that she had been accumulating in memory since November, and that she intended to keep for the rest of her life. She moved into the Archer Ranch house, which became Josephine's home with the natural ease of something finding its proper place. She kept the marigold boxes, because of course she did, and in the spring when she replanted them, she planted them with the same hands that had replanted them every spring since Margaret died, and she thought about Margaret with the tenderness of someone who has inherited something precious and knows it. The school continued and grew. Josephine had written through the winter to the Kansas Territorial Board of Education, making the case for additional funding and resources for rural schools, and in the spring, she received a letter granting a modest but real increase in her supply budget, and more importantly, the formal recognition of the Caldwell Creek School as a permanent institution. She pinned the letter to the wall of the schoolhouse where the children could see it. Eli adapted to the new configuration of his household with the pragmatic acceptance of a child who has been loved consistently and therefore trusts that love tends toward the good. He and Josephine found their own particular ease with each other, not the ease of mother and child, because she was careful never to presume that place, but the ease of 2 people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company and who were both made better by the morning conversations about whatever Eli was thinking about, which were always worth engaging with. Summer arrived, full and golden over the plains, and Josephine found that her first full summer in Kansas had a richness that her first summer's arrival had not prepared her for, because she had not known then what the land looked like when she was at home in it. She rode horses now, having learned through a series of patient lessons from Lionel on Sundays throughout the spring, and she rode out with him sometimes in the evenings when the work of the day was done, into the grass that ran all the way to the horizon in every direction, under that enormous western sky. In those evening rides, she understood something about why a person would leave the East and come here, past the comfort and the familiarity, to this raw and enormous and beautiful place. It was the size of it that did something to the inside of a person, made them feel that they themselves were larger than they had known, or at least had more room to be. "I understand now why you stayed," she said to him one evening, when they had stopped on a rise and the sun was going down behind them and the shadow of the land was reaching east across the grass. "Last winter, when the plague came and everything went wrong, I understand why you didn't leave. Because there is no other place quite like this," he said. He was looking at the horizon with the particular gaze of a man who has stood in this landscape enough times to see its changes. "And because leaving would have been letting something win that doesn't deserve to." She looked at his profile against the orange sky and thought about all the things she had not known on the day she stepped off the stagecoach in the red dust of the main street. She had not known about the flower boxes or the shoes or the Christmas tree or the blizzard with the pot of chili. She had not known about any of it, and yet all of it had been here waiting, the way the grass and the sky and the horizon had all been here, waiting for someone to arrive who could see them properly. Autumn came back around, the 1-year mark of her arrival in Caldwell Creek, and the school opened for its second year with all 12 desks full and a waiting list, because the word had spread farther than the immediate ranches, and families from 8 and 10 miles out were making inquiries. Josephine wrote to the school board about the need for a second classroom, and Lionel went to speak with Tom Cassidy and Patrick O'Brien about labor, because a second classroom needed to be built before winter. The building went up in 3 weekends, the men of the community working together in the way that frontier communities do when something genuinely matters to them, and Josephine stood at the edge of the building site with a mug of coffee in the October sun and watched it go up, and felt the specific satisfaction of something she had begun becoming something larger than herself. That same autumn, she told Lionel that she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday evening, sitting in the kitchen of the ranch house after supper, with the lamplight warm on the table and the sound of Eli's boots on the floor above as he prepared for bed. She said it simply because simple was the only way that seemed to fit the magnitude of it. Lionel was quiet for a long moment. Then he put his hand over hers on the table and looked at her with an expression that contained everything, joy and wonder, and the particular quality of a man who has known loss and therefore knows with his whole body how precious the opposite is. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said. And then, "Good." And then the smile, the full one that changed his face, the one she kept in her memory like something irreplaceable. He told Eli the next morning at breakfast, and Eli received the information with the thoughtful seriousness of a child working through its implications, and then looked up from his cornmeal and said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We won't know for some months," Josephine said. Eli considered this. "I think a brother would be useful," he said, with such plain practicality that both of the adults at the table laughed, and the kitchen was full of it. The warm sound of a family laughing together at breakfast, which is one of the most ordinary and most extraordinary things in the world. The second year of school moved with the fullness of a river that has found its channel, purposeful and flowing. The second classroom was dedicated to the older students, with Samuel Whitfield, now 13, and deeply focused on mathematics in a way that Josephine recognized as genuine aptitude, and 2 older children from farther out ranches who were 14 and 15 and who had never had formal schooling. She taught them separately in the mornings and together in the afternoons, and the cross-age teaching produced something unexpected, which was that the older children developed a sense of responsibility toward the younger ones that extended beyond the schoolroom. Domingo Vega, now 11, had become one of her most reliable students and had developed a particular gift for language, writing with a vividness that she encouraged by giving him every book she could find or borrow. His father Raphael came to the school one afternoon to speak with her, with the same hat-in-hands formality of his first visit, and said that Domingo talked about school the way other children talked about games. That school was the best part of every day. "He is a remarkable boy," Josephine said. "I hope you know that." Raphael looked at his hat for a moment and then at her. "I know," he said. "Thank you for making sure he knows it too." She sat with that for a long time after he left, because it was precisely what education was for, precisely why she had come, precisely why she would stay. In March of that second year, in the same month as her wedding anniversary, Josephine gave birth to a boy. He arrived in the early morning, delivered by Dr. Callum Hare with the efficient calm of a man who had by then attended several frontier births and who was considerably better at it than when he had first arrived in Kansas. Mrs. Flores was there, and Edna Prout, who had arrived uninvited and been unable to be dissuaded, and who proved to be exactly the steady and practical presence that such occasions require. Lionel sat in the hallway outside the bedroom door for 3 hours and only stopped pacing when Dr. Hare came out and said everything was well, that they had a healthy son. Josephine heard Lionel's voice through the door after Callum told him, a low single syllable of something that was relief and gratitude and love all at once, and she held her son against her chest and felt the world rearrange itself around this new center. They named him Thomas William Archer, Thomas for Josephine's father whose teaching certificate she carried in her trunk, and William for Lionel's father, the cobbler who had come west with nothing but his skills and his willingness. They called him Tom, because Thomas was a large name for a very small person, and Eli accepted his brother with a dignified care that seemed to exceed his 9 years, and that Josephine knew would define who he became. Lionel sat on the edge of the bed that afternoon with Tom in the crook of his arm, looking at his son with the same quality of attention he gave everything that mattered to him, the deep, unhurried kind, and Josephine watched them from the pillow and thought about the stagecoach and the red dust and the empty schoolhouse and the jar of preserved peaches and the dried wildflowers in a glass of water. And she thought that the distance from that moment to this one was both enormous and entirely logical. Like following a river from its source to where it opens into something larger. "He has your eyes," Lionel said, looking up from the baby to her. "He has your ears," she said. "My ears are not unusual," he said with mild dignity. "They are quite remarkable, actually," she said. "They are ears that listen carefully to everything. I noticed them early on." He looked at her with an expression that was amused and tender and entirely unguarded. "You noticed my ears." "Among other things," she said. Eli, who was sitting cross-legged on the foot of the bed looking at his brother with an expression of concentrated interest, said without looking up, "You're making faces at each other again." "We are not making faces," Lionel said. "You make faces at each other all the time," Eli said, with the calm authority of a child who has been observing this phenomenon for a year. "It is very obvious." Josephine looked at Lionel. Lionel looked at Josephine. They were both unmistakably making faces at each other. "I suppose we do," Josephine said. Summer came on again, and Caldwell Creek was different in the summer of 1880 than it had been in the summer of 1878, when Josephine had stepped off the stagecoach into its heat and emptiness. There were new families in town, a blacksmith who had brought his wife and 4 children, a miller whose operation on the creek had been completed the previous autumn, and 2 younger families who had come from Missouri looking for land, who had heard about Caldwell Creek through the kind of word of mouth that attaches to places that are beginning to be themselves. The school had 14 students now, and Josephine had written to the territorial board again about the formal qualification of a second teacher, because she could not teach 2 rooms effectively alone, and she had been promised that the matter was being considered. Lionel had told her that he would contribute to the salary himself if the board proved slow, and she had told him that she appreciated the offer and that she was going to get the board to do their part properly, and he had said that he believed she would, which was the most useful form of support she could have received. In that summer, Josephine also began a lending library. It started with the books she had accumulated, the donations from St. Louis, and the volumes she had acquired through correspondence with anyone willing to send books to a frontier school. She put a shelf in the entrance of the schoolhouse with a simple system of borrowing by name and date, and she opened it to the adults of the community on Saturday mornings, and the first Saturday, 12 people came. Lionel came that first Saturday too, which surprised her, because she had not expected him to be among the early adopters. He browsed the shelf with the same careful attention he brought to everything, and selected a book on irrigation engineering with the complete unself-consciousness of a man who sees learning as a practical tool and not a social performance. "You look pleased," he said, seeing her expression. "I am pleased," she said. "You are the first adult borrower." "I want to understand the creek better," he said, with characteristic simplicity. "The summer's been dry and I've been thinking about water management for the south pasture." She looked at him with the warm, complicated feeling that she had by now fully accepted as the natural state of being in love with Lionel Archer. "That is exactly why libraries exist," she said. He took the book home and brought it back 2 weeks later with careful notes in a small notebook that he also showed her. His thinking about the South Pasture Creek and the seasonal flow patterns, all of it rendered in the same methodical way that she saw in Eli's approach to problems, the same quality of mind running through the two of them like a vein of good timber. The second Saturday of the library's opening, 23 people came. Autumn of 1880 brought the formal appointment of a second teacher, a young man named Arthur Briggs from Topeka, 22 years old, who arrived in Caldwell Creek on the September stagecoach with the expression of someone who has been told one thing about a place and is prepared to find another. What he found was a school with 2 classrooms and 14 eager students, and a schoolmistress who was entirely clear about what she expected, which was that every child in the room would be treated as capable of learning anything that was properly taught. Arthur Briggs turned out to be an excellent teacher. He was enthusiastic and slightly nervous in a way that the older students found endearing, and he had a facility for mathematics that complemented Josephine's literary and geographical strengths beautifully. By November, they had developed a collaborative teaching arrangement that was more effective than either of them alone, and the school felt for the first time like an institution rather than a brave experiment. On the 1-year anniversary of Tom's birth, Lionel came home from the south pasture in the early afternoon, which was unusual enough that Josephine looked at him carefully when he came through the door. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "No," he said. He set his hat on the hook by the door, which was always the first thing he did when he came home. He looked at her and at Tom, who was just beginning to walk in the determined, falling forward way of new walkers, holding onto the furniture and looking triumphant. "I just wanted to be home," he said. She looked at him. "You rode in from the south pasture in the middle of the afternoon because you wanted to be home." "Yes," he said. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Flores is making something good for supper. I can smell it from here." "That's not the reason," he said. "I know," she said. "Come in and sit down." He sat at the kitchen table, and Tom pulled himself along the chair legs to reach him, and was picked up and settled in his father's lap with the authoritative comfort of a small person who knows where he belongs. And Lionel sat at the kitchen table with his son in the afternoon light, and looked at Josephine across the table with an expression that she had spent 2 years learning to read, and that she now understood completely. "I used to think," he said, choosing his words with care, "that the ranch was the thing that mattered most, the land and the cattle and keeping everything going, and those things do matter, but they are not the thing." He looked at Tom, who was examining his father's shirt button with total absorption. "This is the thing." Josephine put her hand on the table and he put his over it. "I know," she said. Outside, the Kansas autumn was doing what Kansas autumn does, sweeping great golden distances under a sky that seemed to go all the way to the edge of the world. Inside the kitchen, the smell of whatever misses. Flores was making rows from the stove, and somewhere in the house above them Eli was working on the map he was making of the entire creek system that ran through the ranch's land, a project that had grown from a school assignment into something that Lionel was already talking about using for the water management work he was planning in the spring. Josephine taught school the next morning, and the morning after that, and all the mornings that followed. The library grew. The school grew. Arthur Briggs fell in love with the daughter of the miller, and was married the following spring in the same church where Josephine and Lionel had been married. And Josephine sat in the third row with Tom on her knee, and felt the specific joy of watching something good continue. Domingo Vega, at 12, wrote a story that Josephine submitted to the Kansas City Times newspaper under his own name, and it was published in the December edition. A remarkable thing, a frontier boy's story in a city newspaper. And when Josephine showed the printed page to Raphael, he held it in both hands for a long moment without speaking, and then looked up at her with his eyes bright. And she understood that she would never in her life do anything more important than what she did every morning in that schoolhouse. Samuel Whitfield, at 15, passed the territorial examination for advanced mathematics with a score that Dr. Callum Hare, who had helped him study, declared was the highest he had ever personally witnessed. Samuel's father came to the school with a solemn formality that was his version of great emotion, shook Josephine's hand firmly, and said that whatever she needed from his ranch for the school, she had only to ask. Eli Archer turned 11 in that second autumn, and was already the kind of student that teachers sometimes encounter once or twice in a career. A student who does not simply absorb what is taught but transforms it into something new, who asks the question that opens the door the teacher hadn't seen yet. He was going to need more than Caldwell Creek could provide him before very long, and Josephine had already begun writing to academic institutions in Topeka and Kansas City about preparatory examination correspondence programs that might serve a student who could not yet travel far from his family's ranch. She discussed this with Lionel one evening after Eli had gone to bed, sitting by the fire in the front room with Tom asleep in his cradle nearby, the kind of quiet evening that had become the heart of her life. "He's going to need to go east eventually," she said, "for proper advanced schooling. Not for years yet, but we should be thinking about it." Lionel was quiet, looking at the fire. She knew what the quiet contained, the particular complexity of a father whose first instinct is to keep his child close and whose next, stronger instinct is to give that child everything he deserves. "He's already further than I went," he said. "I never had any schooling beyond the basics." "You are one of the most educated people I know," she said, meaning it. He looked at her. "Education and formal schooling are not the same thing," she said. "You know that." "You taught me that," he said. "You already knew it," she said. "I just said it out loud." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the firelight with their son sleeping nearby, and the plains outside dark and wide and full of wind. And Josephine thought that she had arrived in Caldwell Creek with a leather satchel and a conviction and 12 empty desks, and that what she had now was too large and too specific to be described in a single word. So she held it in the way she held everything that mattered most, carefully and with both hands. The spring of 1881 arrived with a drama that the plains seemed to save for their best performances. A thunderstorm in April that lasted 2 days and left the grass so green it looked painted, and then a succession of warm, crystalline days that felt like a promise kept. The creek ran full. The south pasture, where Lionel had implemented a modified water management system based on Eli's maps and his irrigation book from the library, held the water better than it ever had. The cattle came through the winter in good condition. Josephine found out she was expecting again in April, and this time she told Lionel in the evening while they were walking along the creek with Tom toddling between them, holding a hand each. And when she told him, he stopped walking and looked at her and then laughed, a clean and uncomplicated laugh of pure gladness, and swung Tom up onto his shoulders, where Tom grabbed his father's hair and crowed with the authority of a small person who doesn't know what the occasion is but is prepared to celebrate it. "Another one," Lionel said. "Another one," she confirmed. "Eli is going to have opinions," he said. "Eli always has opinions," she said. "They are generally well-reasoned." This time it was a girl, born in November, with Lionel's eyes and Josephine's dark hair, and the lungs of someone who intended to be heard. They named her Clara Margaret Archer, Clara for little Clara Harmon, who had been one of Josephine's first 3 students and had grown into a bright, curious 10-year-old, and Margaret for the woman in the marigold boxes, because it seemed right that the name should continue in the family, that it should be carried forward. Eli, who was 12 now and had spent 7 months cultivating opinions about this development, held his sister on the day of her birth with the careful deliberateness of a boy who has been told this is a significant responsibility and has taken that instruction with his whole personality. He looked at her for a long time, studying her face the way he studied maps, and then he looked at his father and said, "She is very small." "You were very small," Lionel said. "I find that difficult to believe," Eli said, which made everyone in the room laugh, including Dr. Hare, who declared it the finest recovery in his medical experience. The school continued into its 3rd year with the school that now had 16 students and 2 teachers, and a library that had acquired enough books to require a second shelf, and that had become the kind of place that Josephine had held in mind as a vision on the day she arrived, a real school, a living institution that the community had made its own. In the spring of 1882, Samuel Whitfield, now 17, left Caldwell Creek for Topeka on the recommendation of Josephine and Dr. Hare, to pursue advanced mathematics at the preparatory school that fed into the Kansas State Agricultural College. He came to say goodbye to Josephine on the morning before he left, and he was 17 and trying to be formal about it. But he was also the boy who had arrived at her school on a gray horse on her first day and had sat in the back desk and given her something to teach that morning when everything else had been absent. "You are going to do remarkable things," she told him plainly. He looked at her with the direct honesty of a young man who has learned that direct honesty is the correct way to address someone he respects. "You made this possible," he said. "I want you to know that I know that." She shook his hand, and he rode out of Caldwell Creek on the same gray horse, which was considerably older and wiser now, toward the stagecoach station at the next town over, and she watched him go from the schoolhouse door. Lionel appeared beside her, because he had ridden into town that morning for supplies and had been at the general store when Samuel came to say his goodbyes to Abe Shelby, and had followed the procession to the school. "First one out of the school and into the world," he said. "Not the last," she said. "No," he agreed, "not the last." She looked at him standing beside her in the April morning, with the grass beginning to green along the sides of the road and the sky enormous overhead, and she thought about all of it again, as she did sometimes, the stagecoach and the empty desks and the long walk out to his ranch, and she thought that the particular marvel of a life is that it cannot be predicted forward from any single point, only understood backward when you are standing in the middle of everything that followed. "Come home for lunch," he said. "Mrs. Flores is making something extraordinary. She mentioned it 3 times this morning, which means it is extremely good." "I have Arthur covering the afternoon lessons," she said. "I thought I'd work on the curriculum maps for next year." "Bring them home," he said. "The kitchen table is larger than your desk." She looked at him. "You just want me home for lunch." "I want you home for lunch," he agreed, making no effort to deny it. "Also, the table is larger." She smiled and went back inside to gather her things, and came out into the spring morning where he was waiting with his horse and one of the spare mounts from the livery, which he had apparently anticipated, and they rode home together along the road that was very familiar to her now, the road she had walked alone in August of 1878 with the red dust on her hem and the conviction that she was doing the right thing. She was still convinced of that. More so, if it was possible to be more so than certainty. Clara was asleep in her cradle in the kitchen when they arrived, watched over by Mrs. Flores, and Tom was in the yard with 2 of the younger ranch hands who had developed an affectionate relationship with him based on his absolute fearlessness around the horses. Eli was at school, where he would remain until 3 o'clock, and would come home full of whatever new question had presented itself that day, which he would proceed to discuss through supper. Josephine spread her curriculum maps on the kitchen table, and Lionel sat across from her with his own work, the spring planning books for the ranch. And they worked in the same room in the same silence that was not silence exactly, but the particular sound of two people who are comfortable enough in the same space to be in it together without effort. Outside, the Kansas spring moved across the land in its vast, unhurried way, and the creek ran clear, and the cattle moved through the pasture in the long light of the afternoon. And somewhere down the road, the town of Caldwell Creek was doing what it had been doing since the hard winter and the cattle plague, and the school board's hopeful advertisement in a Missouri newspaper, which was the thing that frontier towns do when they have decided to survive, which is keep going, keep building, keep sending their children somewhere to learn. The children kept coming to school. Every year they kept coming. And Josephine Abbott Archer kept teaching them, every morning, every afternoon, in the whitewashed building with the bell tower that now held a proper bell, installed by Lionel and Tom Cassidy on a Saturday the previous September, that rang at 8 o'clock every school morning across the Caldwell Creek air with a clarity that could be heard as far as the eastern fence line of the Archer Ranch, where sometimes, when the wind was right and the morning was still, Lionel could hear it from the saddle and would stop for a moment, just for a moment, and listen to the sound of it carrying across the grass. He had told her once that the bell made him think of everything that was right about the world. She had told him that was a great deal to attribute to a bell. He had said that it was not the bell exactly. It was what the bell meant. It was the children who heard it and came toward it. It was the woman who had walked across the plains to argue him into sending his son to school. It was all of it together, and the bell was simply the sound it made. She had not had an argument for that, and so she had not made one. The years collected around them the way that good years do, not in a blur but in a texture, a richness that is made of specific things, specific mornings and specific conversations, and specific moments of ordinary grace that become extraordinary in retrospect. Eli grew into a young man of serious intelligence and quiet humor, who at 16 was corresponding by mail with a mathematics professor in Topeka who had heard of him through Samuel Whitfield. Eli was going to leave for Topeka in another year, and both Josephine and Lionel knew it, and had made their peace with it in the way that parents make peace with the world claiming their children, which is to say not entirely peacefully, but with genuine willingness, because the alternative is to hold something back that deserves to go forward. Tom grew into a bold, physical, joyful child who loved horses and dogs, and his sister with an equality of enthusiasm that delighted everyone around him. He was learning to read with the same passion that other children applied to play, because for him reading about horses was indistinguishable from being near horses. Clara at 3 was a small, certain person with her father's eyes and her mother's conviction, and the combination of these two qualities meant that she had opinions about everything and stated them with perfect clarity, and the household orbited around her cheerfully. The school had 21 students by the fall of 1884, and Arthur Briggs had been joined by his wife as an additional teaching assistant, which Josephine had advocated for with the territorial board in language that left the board very little room to decline. Domingo Vega, now 14, had 3 more pieces published in the Kansas City Times and was being discussed by Josephine in correspondence with the editors of that paper as a future contributor of some real significance. Rafael Vega came to the school on the last day of term that December and waited until the other parents had collected their children, and then he came inside and said to Josephine that Domingo had been offered a correspondence apprenticeship with a writer in Kansas City through connections that the newspaper had facilitated, and that this would change his son's life, and that it would not have been possible without her. "It is possible because of Domingo," she said. "I simply pointed in a direction." "You pointed in a direction," Raphael said, That is everything. She thought about this for a long time afterward, about the idea of pointing in a direction, about what it means to be the person who shows someone where to look. Her father had done that for her. She had tried to do it for the children in this room. And they had done it for each other, she and Lionel, she thought. They had pointed in directions for each other too. She had walked out to his ranch and pointed him toward something he already believed in. He had come to the schoolhouse in February and pointed her toward something she already felt. Between them they had built something that neither of them had been able to build alone, which was the only definition of a good partnership that she had ever found wholly convincing. On the evening of their 6th wedding anniversary, Lionel took her out to the rise above the south pasture where they had ridden in the evenings of their first summer, where the grass ran to the horizon, and the sky held more stars than could be usefully counted. They sat on their horses in the dark, and the warm spring air moved around them, and the ranch lights were visible far below and to the west, the lamp in Eli's window where he was working on something, the kitchen light where Mrs. Flores was finishing the evening, and the lamp that burned in Tom and Clara's room until the children were settled. 6 years, she said. 6 years, he agreed. The south pasture is holding water through June now, he said. Eli's maps were right. Everything Eli maps is right, she said. He gets that from you, Lionel said. He gets it from the library book on irrigation, she said. He gets the part that matters from you, he said. The part that makes him want to understand things properly. She looked at the dark sky and the stars, and thought again about the river from its source, and about the way distance looks different depending on where you are standing, and she felt the deep, simple, uncomplicated rightness of being exactly where she was, on this rise above the south pasture in the 6th year of her marriage. In the town she had arrived in alone with a conviction, and a leather satchel and 12 empty desks waiting. I am happy here, she said, without the qualification she had used 6 years ago when she had said she was becoming happy. The becoming was complete. The happiness was the completed kind now, the hard kind that had become easy because it had been built from something real. Lionel looked at her in the starlight with the look she had been keeping in her memory since November of 1878, the first night on the Harmon porch, the look that was joy made careful and careful made certain over time. Good, he said. He said it simply, as he said most things, because the simplest things were always the most precise. Good. The bell rang in Caldwell Creek every school morning for many years after that, and the children came toward it across the plains and the grass and the red dust of the summer roads. And Josephine Abbott Archer stood at the door of the school she had arrived to find empty and watched them come, every morning, watched them come and was glad.